The North Atlantic, March 17th, 1943, 2:47 in the morning. The sea is black, heaving in 12-foot swells beneath a moonless sky. Captain Lieutenant Siegfried von Forstner stands on the bridge of U-402, salt spray stinging his face, watching the dark silhouettes of 40 merchant ships crawling across the horizon. He's been shadowing this convoy for 6 hours, waiting for the other boats in his wolf pack to get into position. Now it's time to tell them where the prey is. He climbs down the ladder into the control room, water dripping from his leather jacket. "Funker," he says to his radio operator, Oberbootsman Hans Dietrich. "Send the position report to BDU." Dietrich nods and begins encoding the message. Grid coordinates, convoy bearing and speed. U-402's own course and fuel state. Standard procedure. The transmission takes 18 seconds. 90 seconds after that transmission ends, von Forstner and every man aboard his submarine are marked for death. Not 90 minutes, not 90 hours, 90 seconds. A British destroyer 12 miles away has just received von Forstner's exact coordinates, accurate to within 2 miles. The destroyer's captain doesn't know how this is possible. Von Forstner certainly doesn't know. But in 17 minutes, HMS Vimy will arrive at those coordinates. In 44 minutes, U-402 will be crushed at the bottom of the Atlantic, all 47 men dead. And the strangest part? Von Forstner did everything right. He followed his orders. He used proper radio procedure. He kept his transmission brief. He was executing the very tactics that had made German U-boats the most feared weapon in Hitler's arsenal, the iron fist that nearly strangled Britain into submission. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The question isn't why von Forstner radioed that night. The question is why he didn't know that every time a U-boat transmitted, it was painting a target on its own hull. Why did the entire German submarine force spend 4 years broadcasting their positions to their executioners? Why thousands of young men died because their commanders never discovered that the Allies could hear them with terrifying precision? This is the story of how German U-boat wolf packs defeated themselves. How a technology so secret that most Allied officers didn't know it existed turned the hunters into the hunted. How the very coordination that made wolf pack tactics devastating also made them suicidal. And how the Germans, despite mounting evidence, never figured out what was killing them until decades after the war ended. To understand how German submarines destroyed themselves, you need to understand why they were on the radio in the first place. September 1939. The war is 6 days old. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, sits in his operations room in Wilhelmshaven, staring at a map of the Atlantic Ocean. Britain is an island nation. Everything it needs to survive, food, fuel, steel, ammunition, must come by ship. Dönitz has done mathematics. Britain imports 60 million tons of material every year. If Germany can sink 750,000 tons per month, sustained over 12 months, Britain will exhaust its reserves and be forced to negotiate peace. The problem is arithmetic. Dönitz has 57 operational U-boats. Even if all of them were at sea simultaneously, which is impossible, they cannot patrol every convoy route. The Atlantic is simply too vast. A lone submarine hunting the shipping lanes is like a single wolf trying to bring down a herd of buffalo. It might get lucky and catch a straggler, but the herd survives. So Dönitz conceives something new. Not individual submarines hunting alone, the way they did in the First World War. Instead, coordinated groups, of 8 to 20 boats spread in a picket line across the convoy routes. When one U-boat spotted a convoy, it wouldn't attack immediately. That would only scatter the merchants and alert the escorts. Instead, the spotting submarine would shadow the convoy from beyond visual range, surfaced at night to keep pace, and radio its position to Bidu Befehlshaber der Unterseeboot, the U-boat high command. Dönitz and his staff would then vector every available submarine toward that convoy. The boats would converge from multiple directions. At the designated moment, they would surface simultaneously and attack at night, when their low profiles made them nearly invisible, but their diesel engines gave them speed to maneuver. The convoy's escorts would be overwhelmed. 8 submarines attacking from different bearings cannot all be stopped by 3 or 4 destroyers. While the escorts chased one U-boat, the others would be slaughtering the undefended merchant ships. Dönitz called it Rudeltaktik, pack tactics. The British would call it the Wolf Pack, and it would become the stuff of nightmares. But Rudeltaktik required something unprecedented in submarine warfare: constant radio communication. A U-boat commander had to report when he spotted a convoy. He had to provide regular position updates as he shadowed it. He had to confirm when other boats arrived. BDU had to broadcast tactical instructions, coordinate attack times, and redirect boats if the convoy changed course. All of this required high-frequency radio transmissions, beamed from submarines to shore stations and back, dozens of messages per convoy battle. In 1940 and 1941, this system worked beyond Dönitz's most optimistic projections. June 1940. France has fallen. Dönitz moved his operational headquarters to occupied France, to Kernevel, outside the port of Lorient. From here, his headquarters is 700 miles closer to the Atlantic convoy routes than it was in Germany. The U-boats have new bases in Brest, La Pallice, Saint-Nazaire, Bordeaux. They can reach the mid-Atlantic patrol zones faster, spend more time hunting and less time in transit. And the British are reeling. The Royal Navy is stretched catastrophically thin. After Dunkirk, after the fall of France, Britain stands alone. Its convoy escorts are often a single destroyer and perhaps 2 corvettes, small, slow anti-submarine vessels, trying to protect 40 or 50 merchant ships spread across miles of ocean. When a wolf pack attacks at night, the escorts are simply overwhelmed. The period from June 1940 to February 1941 became known in the U-boat force as Die gut glückliche Zeit, the happy time. In those 8 months, German submarines sank over 2 million tons of Allied shipping. Individual commanders become celebrities in Germany. Günther Prien, who had snuck into Scapa Flow in October 1939 and sank the battleship Royal Oak, accounts for over 30 ships. Otto Kretschmer sank 47 vessels totaling nearly 300,000 tons. Joachim Schepke, Heinrich Lieber, Engelbert Endras, these names appear in German newsreels. Their commanders awarded the Knight's Cross, lionized by Goebbels' propaganda machine. British merchant sailors call the Atlantic Torpedo Junction. Convoys that leave Halifax or New York lose 10, 15, sometimes 20% of their ships in a single crossing. The mathematics are brutal and unsustainable. In 1940, Britain lost over 4 million tons of shipping. Construction replaces only 1.2 million tons. The reserves are shrinking. Churchill would write later, in his war memoirs, that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril, not the Blitz, not the threat of invasion in 1940. The U-boats. because if the submarines cut Britain's Atlantic lifeline, the island would starve. The war would be over without Germany ever needing to invade, and the Wolfpack tactics were the key to that success. The coordinated attacks, the massed submarines converging on a single convoy, this was what made the difference. This was what allowed 50 U-boats to sink hundreds of ships. But those Wolfpack tactics required radio transmissions. Every single time a U-boat broke radio silence to report a convoy position, to request instructions, to coordinate with other boats, it was sending out electromagnetic waves in all directions. High-frequency radio waves travelling at the speed of light, and the British were listening. June 1940. While U-boats prowled the Atlantic, a team of British scientists and naval officers at the Admiralty Research Laboratory in Teddington, southwest of London, were perfecting a technology that would change naval warfare forever. They called it high-frequency direction finding. The technology had existed in crude form since the First World War, but the British had refined it, miniaturized it, and most importantly, made it accurate enough to matter in combat. The sailors and radio operators who used it daily gave it a simpler name, Huff-Duff. The principle was straightforward. When a radio transmitter broadcasts a signal, it emits electromagnetic waves that radiate outward in all directions. A receiver tuned to that frequency can detect those waves. But here's the crucial part. A specialized directional antenna can determine which direction those waves are coming from. You point the antenna in different directions until you find the bearing where the signal is strongest. That bearing is a line pointing back toward the transmitter. One receiver gives you one line. Two receivers, positioned miles apart, give you two lines. Plot those lines on a map. Where they intersect, that's where the transmitter is. But turning that simple principle into a weapon that could kill submarines in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean required solving enormous technical problems. The antenna had to be directional enough to give an accurate bearing, but small enough to fit on a ship or at a shore station. The receiver had to be sensitive enough to detect a brief transmission from hundreds of miles away, but selective enough not to be overwhelmed by all the other radio traffic filling the airwaves. The operators had to be trained to take bearings quickly before the transmission ended, and the entire network of stations had to be coordinated so their bearings could be plotted simultaneously. By mid-1940, the British had solved these problems. The Huff-Duff receiver used a Bellini-Tosi directional antenna system, essentially two loop antennas mounted at right angles, connected to a cathode ray oscilloscope. When a transmission came in, the operator would watch the oscilloscope screen. The signal appeared as a glowing line. By adjusting controls, the operator could rotate the antenna pattern until the line reached maximum brightness, indicating the bearing to the transmitter. The operator would read the bearing off a calibrated dial and immediately phone or teletype it to the plotting center. The theoretical accuracy was remarkable, within 2 degrees of arc. At a range of 500 miles, 2 degrees of arc meant a position accurate to within 17 miles. At closer ranges, the accuracy improved. 2 Huff-Duff stations 300 miles apart, both detecting a U-boat transmission at 200 miles range, could pinpoint that submarine to within a 5-mile radius. And the speed was astonishing. From the moment a U-boat began transmitting to the moment the Allied plotting centers had calculated its position, 90 seconds. 90 seconds. The British built Huff-Duff stations across the United Kingdom, in Northern Ireland, in Iceland, after the British occupied it in May 1940, and later in Newfoundland after the Americans entered the war. They installed Huff-Duff equipment on escort ships, the destroyers and frigates that accompanied the convoys. By mid-1941, they had created a network that could detect and locate any U-boat that transmitted anywhere in the North Atlantic. But having the technology wasn't enough. To make Huff-Duff truly effective as a weapon, the British had to keep it secret, completely secret, not just from the Germans, but from their own people, because if the Germans discovered that the Allies could pinpoint a transmitting U-boat within minutes, they would change their tactics. They would limit radio transmissions, or change frequencies, or develop some countermeasures, and the entire advantage would evaporate. So the British created an elaborate deception. When Huff-Duff located a U-boat, the escort ships wouldn't immediately steam toward that position. That would be too obvious. Instead, they would first send up an aircraft if one was available to spot the submarine visually. Or they would wait until the convoy's course naturally brought them close to the U-boat's position, then accidentally detect it with radar or sonar. They created plausible explanations for every intercept. They varied their response patterns. Sometimes, after getting a Huff-Duff fix on a U-boat, they would deliberately not respond at all, sacrificing the tactical opportunity to preserve the strategic secret. Other times they would respond, but indirectly routing the convoy away from the U-boat rather than sending escorts to attack it. And most remarkably, they restricted knowledge of Huff-Duff's true capabilities even within the Allied military. Most British naval officers were told that Huff-Duff could provide a general area, perhaps a 100-mile radius, useful for knowing that U-boats were nearby but not precise enough for targeting. Only a small number of officers at Western Approaches Command in Liverpool, the headquarters directing convoy operations, knew the truth, that Huff-Duff was accurate to a few miles and fast enough to vector escorts onto a transmitting U-boat while it was still in the area. The Americans, when they entered the war, were read into the secret on a strict need-to-know basis. Even after the war, many Allied veterans didn't learn the full truth about Huff-Duff for decades. The British kept the secret locked down because they had learned the lesson from World War I, when Allied loose lips about new technologies had allowed the Germans to develop countermeasures. This time, the secret was held, and the Germans had no idea what was killing them. By 1942, Dönitz began to notice something disturbing in his casualty reports. The U-boats were sinking fewer ships per patrol. The tonnage figures were still impressive, over 6 million tons sunk in 1942, but the efficiency was declining. Worse, he was losing more submarines. 87 U-boats sank in 1942, compared to 35 in 1941. The casualty rate was climbing. Dönitz and his staff analyzed the losses, trying to understand what had changed. They knew the Allies had improved their tactics. Escort groups were better trained, more coordinated. Aircraft were covering more of the Atlantic, forcing U-boats to remain submerged during daylight. Radar was becoming more common on escort ships and aircraft, making it harder for surfaced U-boats to escape detection. But there was something else, something Dönitz couldn't quite identify. Too often, escort ships seemed to appear out of nowhere, heading straight for a U-boat's position. Too often, a submarine would transmit a position report and then, within an hour or two, find itself under attack by destroyers that shouldn't have known it was there. German naval intelligence investigated. They suspected radar, but radar's range was limited, and it didn't explain how escorts sometimes changed course toward a U-boat from 20 miles away, beyond radar range. They suspected the Allies had broken their Enigma codes, but the submarines encrypted all radio transmissions, and the codes were changed regularly. They suspected spies, but how could spies report real-time positions of submarines in the middle of the Atlantic? They did consider radio direction finding. The Germans had their own version, called Funkpeilung. But German Funkpeilung was crude, useful only for getting a rough bearing to a transmission, accurate to maybe 10 or 15 degrees, useful over hundreds of miles but not precise enough to target a specific submarine. German intelligence assumed that if the Allies had direction finding, it would be similar to Germany's own system, helpful for strategic intelligence, knowing generally where U-boats were operating, but not accurate enough to vector escorts onto a specific boat. The idea that the British could pinpoint a submarine to within a couple of miles in 90 seconds seemed technologically impossible, so they dismissed it. Instead, Dönitz's response to increasing losses was to double down on the tactics that had worked: more U-boats at sea, larger wolf packs, more coordination, more radio traffic. By 1942, a typical wolf pack battle involved dozens of radio transmissions. A U-boat would spot a convoy and transmit the sighting report. BDU would acknowledge and broadcast orders to other boats in the area. As the boats converged, they would report their positions, their fuel states, their torpedo counts. During the attack, commanders would report their successes, their failures, and damage to their boats. After the attack, there would be more reports, final tallies, requests for instructions, decisions about whether to continue pursuing or break off. All of this required high-frequency radio transmissions, and every single transmission was detected by the Huff-Duff network. The Allied plotting centres at Western Approaches Command in Liverpool, at the Admiralty in London, and at the convoy routing centres in Halifax and New York maintained 24-hour watch on the high-frequency bands. Trained operators, many of them women from the WRNS, the Women's Royal Naval Service, sat at Huff-Duff receivers, headphones on, watching their oscilloscope screens, waiting. When a U-boat transmitted, multiple stations would simultaneously detect it. The operators would note the bearing, the time, the signal strength. They would phone or teletype these bearings to the plotting centres within seconds. At the plotting centres, other WRNS officers would plot the bearings on large, translucent map tables, the kind where you stood above the map and marked positions with grease pencils. Where the bearing lines intersected, they would place a marker, U-boat position, with the time of the fix. If the U-boat was near a convoy, or near the convoy's projected course, the information would be radioed to the convoy's escort commander immediately. The escort commander would then have to make a decision. If he had enough ships, he could detach a Gentalos, a destroyer or two, to investigate the position. If he was short on escorts, he might change the convoy's course to avoid the U-boat. If the convoy had air cover, a long-range patrol aircraft, or, increasingly by mid-1942, a small escort carrier, he could vector the aircraft to the U-boat's position. From the German perspective, these responses looked like uncanny luck, or perhaps some technology they didn't understand. But never direction finding. Never something as simple and devastating as the Allies being able to hear exactly where you were the moment you pressed the transmit key. And so the wolf packs kept transmitting, because they had to. Because Rudeltaktik, the doctrine that had nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic, required constant communication. A U-boat that maintained radio silence couldn't be vectored toward convoys. It couldn't coordinate with other boats. It couldn't participate in the massed attacks that made wolf packs effective. It was useless. The Germans were trapped by their own success. The wolf packs worked when they could concentrate on a convoy. They were still devastatingly effective, but the very coordination that made them deadly also made them visible, and they never realized it. The killing reached its climax in the spring of 1943. By this point, the Battle of the Atlantic had become a pure attrition struggle. Dönitz had over 400 U-boats operational, the largest submarine fleet ever assembled. He was deploying 100 boats at sea simultaneously, forming multiple wolf packs across the North Atlantic convoy routes. The Germans were sinking merchant ships faster than ever before, but they were also losing U-boats faster than ever before, and the mathematics of attrition were turning against them. In January 1943, the U-boats sank 37 ships. In February, 63 ships. In March, 108 ships over 600,000 tons, the highest monthly of total since November 1942. The wolf packs were mauling convoys, achieving the kind of concentrated slaughter that Dönitz had envisioned. But in those same 3 months, Germany lost 68 U-boats. The replacement rate couldn't keep up. German shipyards were building 30 U-boats per month, an impressive feat of industrial production. But they needed to build more than 23 per month just to break even against the current loss rate. And the loss rate was accelerating. April 1943, 15 U-boats lost. May 1943, 41 U-boats lost. 41 submarines in 30 days. More than one U-boat is destroyed every 18 hours, on average. Some days, the Germans lost 2 or 3 boats. The casualty rate had become unsustainable, and the Allies knew exactly why the loss rate was climbing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The statistics told a story that the Germans couldn't quite read. In 1943, Allied records showed that 38% of U-boat kills occurred within 2 hours of the submarine making a radio transmission. 23% occurred within 30 minutes. If Dönitz and his staff had access to this data, which they didn't, because they only knew when U-boats failed to return, not always the precise circumstances of their deaths, and if they had performed a rigorous statistical analysis, correlating radio transmissions with losses, the pattern would have been undeniable. But they didn't have the complete data, and even if they had, acknowledging what it meant would have required abandoning the entire strategic foundation of their Atlantic campaign. Admiral Sir Max Houghton, who commanded Western approaches from November 1942 onward, kept meticulous records. His staff tracked every U-boat transmission detected by Huff-Duff, every convoy battle, every submarine kill. They could see the correlation clearly. When U-boats transmitted frequently during an attack, coordinating their wolf-pack tactics, they died in greater numbers. When individual submarines maintained radio silence and hunted alone, they survived longer, but they also sank far fewer ships. The Allies had discovered the fundamental vulnerability of the wolf-pack doctrine. You cannot coordinate without communicating, and you cannot communicate without being heard. By March 1943, Houghton had refined the use of Huff-Duff to a deadly art. When a wolf pack began shadowing a convoy, the Huff-Duff network would detect the submarine's position reports. Houghton's staff would plot the U-boat positions on their map tables and calculate which submarines were closing on the convoy and which were still distant. If the convoy had adequate escort, Houghton would order support groups, additional destroyers and frigates held in reserve for this purpose to steam toward the Huff-Duff contacts and engage the U-boats before they could attack. If the convoy had air cover, long-range B-24 Liberators operating from Iceland or Newfoundland, or Swordfish aircraft from an escort carrier, Those planes would be vectored to the U-boat positions within minutes of detection. The aircraft would force the submarines to dive, breaking their shadowing contact with the convoy. While submerged, a U-boat could only make 7 or 8 knots, far too slow to keep pace with a convoy making 9 or 10 knots. By the time the submarine surfaced again, the convoy would be over the horizon, contact lost. This was an invisible battle that the Germans couldn't see. Every time a U-boat commander reported convoy sighted, am shadowing, he was alerting not just his own command but also the enemy. Every time BDU broadcast all boats converge on grid AJ 7 to 9, the Allies heard it too, and they knew exactly which submarines were where and where they were heading. The wolf packs were fighting blind against an enemy who could see them perfectly. March 16, 1943. Convoy HX229 departs New York Harbor, bound for Liverpool. 40 merchant ships, laden with war materials, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, fuel oil, foodstuffs. The cargo is worth millions of pounds sterling and represents months of American industrial production. The convoy's safe arrival could supply British forces for weeks. Its destruction would be a catastrophic loss. The escort is typical for this period. 1 destroyer, HMS Volunteer, serving as the escort commander's ship, 4 corvettes, small anti-submarine vessels, displacing only 900 tons each, and 2 armed trawlers. 7 warships to protect 40 merchants spread across 9 square miles of ocean. The convoy's routing takes it along the Great Circle route toward Britain, passing south of Iceland, then east into the North Channel. This route unavoidably crosses the Mid-Atlantic Gap, that stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft, where convoys are most vulnerable. The Allies call it the Black Pit. The Germans call it the Happy Hunting Ground. Dönitz has positioned 3 wolf packs across the convoy routes in the Black Pit. Gruppe Raubgraf, 17 U-boats strung in a patrol line 500 miles long. Gruppe Stürmer, 11 boats. Gruppe Dränger, 18 boats. 46 submarines, representing the largest concentration of U-boats ever assembled, waiting for the eastbound convoys. U-402 is part of Gruppe Raubgraf. Siegfried von Forstner has been on patrol for 23 days. This is his 12th war patrol since taking command in April 1941. He has sunk 16 ships totaling over 80,000 tons. His crew calls him Der Glückspilz, the lucky mushroom, because he always seems to find targets and always seems to bring his crew home. He wears the Knight's Cross at his throat. He is 29 years old. On March 16th, at 1400 hours 2 in the afternoon, von Forstner's bridge watched spots smoke on the horizon. The watch officer calls down to the control room. Von Forstner climbs to the bridge with his binoculars. He counts the masts. At least 30 ships, probably more. A major convoy. He orders the boat to shadow from beyond visual range. He notes the convoy's course, roughly 070 degrees, east-northeast and speed, which he estimates at 9 knots. He descends to the control room and tells his radio operator, Oberbootsman Hans Dietrich, to encode a sighting report for BDU. Dietrich encrypts the message using the Enigma machine. Convoy position in the naval grid system, bearing, speed, composition. The encrypted message is converted to Morse code. At 1520 hours, Dietrich transmits. The message takes 11 seconds. At that moment, 3 Huff-Duff stations detect the transmission simultaneously. One station is at Skegness on the English coast. One is at Akureyri in northern Iceland. One is at Wick in northern Scotland. Each operator takes a bearing within seconds. The bearings are telephoned to the Western Approaches Command plotting room in Liverpool. A WRNS officer, a young woman named Margaret Brooke, 23 years old, who before the war taught primary school in Manchester, plots the three bearing lines on the map table. They intersect at 57 degrees north, 33 degrees west. She marks the position and notes the time, 15:21 hours, 3 minutes after the transmission. The plot shows U-402 is approximately 280 miles east-southeast of Iceland and about 40 miles southwest of convoy HX-229's projected position. A duty commander reviews the plot. He checks the positions of available support vessels. HMS Vimy, a destroyer, is escorting convoy ON-170 westbound, about 70 miles northeast of the U-boat contact. But ON-170 is nearly past the danger zone, approaching the range of Iceland-based aircraft. Vimy can be detached. At 15:40 hours, Vimy receives coded orders. Detach from ON-170. Proceed course 190 to investigate submarine contact. The orders include the precise coordinates from the Huff-Duff fix. Commander John Harrison, Vimy's captain, acknowledges the order. He doesn't know about Huff-Duff. He assumes this is a radar contact or perhaps an aircraft sighting. He doesn't question how the Admiralty knows there's a U-boat at this exact position. He simply obeys. Vimy turns south and increases to 28 knots. Aboard U-402, von Forstner has no idea that he's been located. He continues shadowing the convoy, staying on the surface, remaining at the convoy's beam off to the side where he's least likely to be spotted. He periodically updates his plot of the convoy's course and speed. As twilight approaches, he prepares to close the distance. The plan is to attack after full darkness, when the U-boat's low silhouette makes it nearly invisible. But first, he needs to send another position report to BDU, so the other boats in Gruppe Robgraf can find the convoy. At 20:03 hours 8:03 p.m. U-402 transmits again. This time, the message is slightly longer. Updated convoy position, his own position, his intention to close and attack after dark. The transmission lasts 16 seconds. Again, the Huff-Duff network detects it. Again, the bearings are plotted in Liverpool. The new fix shows U-402 has moved northeast, still shadowing the convoy. The plot is passed to the escort commander of HX-229 aboard HMS Volunteer. Lieutenant Commander James Plomer, commanding Volunteer, now knows there's a U-boat to his southwest, approximately 20 miles away. But he has a dilemma. If he detaches ships from the screen to hunt the U-boat, he weakens the convoy's protection. If he ignores the U-boat, it will attack tonight, and there may be other submarines nearby that he doesn't know about. He decides to wait for Vimy, which is now only 30 miles away. Two destroyers hunting together are far more effective than one, and in the meantime, he alters the convoy's course slightly to the north, opening the distance from the known U-boat position. Von Forstner notices the convoy's course change at 2200 hours 10 p.m. This is concerning. Did they spot him? Unlikely he's maintaining a 10-mile distance, well beyond visual range in the darkness. Perhaps the convoy is zigzagging, standard evasion procedure. He adjusts his own course to match. By 0100 hours on March 17, 1 a.m. von Forstner decides the convoy has steadied on its new course. He orders the boat to increase speed and close the distance. By 2:30, he's within 8 miles of the convoy. He can see the dark shapes of the merchant ships against the slightly lighter sky. Perfect attack position. But before attacking, he needs to send one more transmission. Protocol requires reporting his attack position so BDU knows where he is, and so other U-boats won't accidentally torpedo each other in the darkness. He also wants to update BDU on the convoy's course change. At 2:47 a.m. Hans Dietrich transmits the message. 18 seconds. HMS Vimy is 12 miles to the northeast. Within 40 seconds of U-402's transmission, the Huff-Duff bearing is radioed from Liverpool directly to Vimy. Commander Harrison plots the position. He's already close. The U-boat is almost exactly where the previous fixes predicted it would be, given the convoy's course and the time elapsed. Harrison doesn't hesitate. He orders flank speed, of course 230, directly toward the U-boat contact. Vimy's engines push her to 31 knots, her hull vibrating, bow waves curling white in the darkness. Aboard U-402, von Forstner secures the radio room and orders the boat to dive to periscope depth. Standard procedure before an attack. At periscope depth around 12 meters, the U-boat is mostly submerged, harder to detect, but the periscope allows him to observe the convoy and line up his torpedo shots. He has no idea a destroyer is racing toward his position at 30 knots. At 03:04 a.m. Vimy's sonar operator, sitting in the cramped ASDIC compartment, headphones clamped over his ears, hears the distinctive echo of a submerged submarine. The metallic ping of the sonar pulse reflects off U-402's steel hull. Contact, bearing 268, range 800 yards. Commander Harrison is on the bridge. He orders the helm hard to port, bringing Vimy's bow to point directly at the contact. The sonar operator continues calling ranges, 700 yards, 600, 500. Von Forstner hears the destroyer's screws through the hull. The rhythmic churning is unmistakable, growing louder rapidly. Too loud, too close. "Emergency dive," he shouts. "Take her down, 150 meters." The diving planes tilt sharply. The chief engineer opens the ballast tank vents fully. The boat tilts bow down, plunging deeper. Men grab handholds. In the torpedo room, a crewman who wasn't holding on falls against the bulkhead. But they're too late. At 03:06, Vimy reaches the attack position. The depth charge crews have already loaded a pattern. 6 charges, set for 3 different depths, 100 meters, 150 meters, and 200 meters. They drop the charges off the stern rails and fire them from the side throwers. Von Forstner hears them falling. 6 splashes, then nothing. 6 seconds of silence as the charges sink. Then the ocean tries to crush them. The explosions aren't loud underwater. They're more like deep, resonant thuds, felt as much as heard. But the shock waves hit the submarine like hammering fists. The hull rings like a bell. Light bulbs shatter. Valves crack. Men are thrown off their feet. In the control room, von Forstner grabs the chart table to steady himself. The depth gauge shows 120 meters, and still descending. The explosions were close, very close, but the hull has held. He orders the dive to continue to 200 meters. At that depth, the U-boat will be below the normal depth charge setting, and the pressure will be near the design limit. But they need to get away from the destroyer. The hull groans as the pressure increases. At 180 meters, the chief engineer reports a leak in a valve fitting. Just a spray, not a major rupture. They can manage it. 200 meters. Von Forstner orders silent running. All machinery except essential systems is shut down. No movement. No talking. Breathe slowly. Make no noise. Perhaps the destroyer will lose them. Above, Vimy's sonar has lost contact. The depth charge explosions have stirred up turbulence, and the submarine is now below the thermocline. a temperature boundary in the water that bends sonar beams, creating a blind zone. Commander Harrison orders a search pattern. Vimy begins a careful box search, sonar pinging constantly, listening for any echo that might reveal the U-boat. For 23 minutes, there's silence. U-402 sits at 200 meters, barely moving, drifting with the current. The only sounds are the quiet hiss of compressed air, the occasional creak of the pressure hull, the breathing of 47 men who are trying very hard not to make any noise. Some of the crew are praying. Von Forstner can see their lips moving silently. He doesn't stop them. He's not particularly religious himself, but he understands that at 200 meters depth, with a destroyer hunting overhead, prayer feels like a reasonable precaution. At 03:29, Vimy's sonar operator picks up a new echo, faint but distinct, bearing 272 range, 1,000 yards. The U-boat has drifted during its silent running, and the thermocline layer has shifted slightly. Harrison orders another attack run. This time, the depth charge pattern is different. 8 charges, set for 150, 200, and 250 meters. They're going deeper, bracketing the probable depth of the submarine. Von Forstner hears the destroyer's screws again, the sound building rapidly. He realizes they've been found. There's no point in silent running now. He orders an emergency blow compressed air forced into the ballast tanks to surface the submarine. If they can get to the surface, they can abandon ship, giving the crew a chance to survive. At 200 meters depth, if the hull ruptures, death will be instantaneous. But the depth charges fall before U-402 can rise. The first explosion hits close to the stern, in the aft torpedo room. The shock wave ruptures the pressure hull. Water explodes into the compartment, with such force that it tears men apart. The compartment floods completely in 3 seconds. 8 men die instantly. The second explosion, half a second later, ruptures the stern ballast tanks. The submarine's stern fills with water. The boat tilts violently, stern down, 45 degrees. In the control room, von Forstner is thrown against the periscope housing. He hears screaming from aft, cut off abruptly as watertight doors slam shut. The chief engineer is shouting damage reports. Stern compartment flooded, pressure hull breached, negative buoyancy, unable to surface. The third explosion cracks the pressure hull amidships. Not a full rupture, but enough. Water begins spraying into the diesel engine room, a jet of water under immense pressure that cuts like a blade. Von Forstner knows what these sounds mean. He's heard them before, in the stories told by the few U-boat crews who survived depth charge attacks. He knows the boat is finished. "All hands forward," he shouts. "Abandon the compartments. Close all watertight doors." But it's too late for that to matter. The submarine is sinking stern first, tilting past 60 degrees now. The emergency blow system is useless, the aft tanks are ruptured, and blowing the forward tanks just makes the tilt worse. At 03:31, U-402 slides past 250 meters. This is 20 meters beyond the boat's crush depth. The pressure hull, already cracked and weakened, begins to fail catastrophically. The implosion is instantaneous. The hull sections that haven't already ruptured simply collapse inward as the ocean's pressure, 370 pounds per square inch, becomes too much for the steel to bear. The air inside the submarine compresses violently, heating to oven temperatures for a fraction of a second before the cold ocean water rushes in. For the 39 men still alive in the forward compartments, death comes too quickly for conscious thought. One moment they exist. The next moment, the universe crushes them into nothing. U-402 falls the remaining 2.5 miles to the ocean floor, tumbling slowly as it descends, scattering pieces of hull, plating and equipment as it goes. It comes to rest on the abyssal plain at 15,000 feet depth, far beyond the reach of any salvage or recovery. On the surface, Commander Harrison sees oil bubbling up, then debris, pieces of wood, a life jacket, some papers. No survivors. He orders Vimy to rejoin the convoy. The entire engagement, from first detection to confirmed kill, took 27 minutes. From von Forstner's final radio transmission to his death, 44 minutes. At BDU headquarters in Paris, Dönitz had moved the command center there in March 1942. The operations staff noted that U-402 had stopped transmitting. This isn't immediately alarming. U-boats often maintain radio silence for hours or days, especially when attacking or evading. But when von Forstner fails to report for 24 hours, then 48 hours, then 72 hours, he's quietly listed as missing. After 2 weeks with no contact, U-402 is presumed lost. The cause is listed as unknown, possibly aircraft attack, possibly depth charges from convoy escorts, possibly a mine. The staff has no way to know for certain. What they don't know, what they never suspect, is that von Forstner marked his own position for the enemy every time he transmitted. His final message, at 2:47 a.m. on March 17th, gave the British his exact coordinates. That a destroyer was vectored to those coordinates at flank speed and killed him before he could fire a single torpedo. The staff adds U-402 to the casualty list and moves on. There are hundreds of other U-boats to manage, dozens of convoy battles to coordinate. One lost submarine, while tragic, is simply the cost of the campaign, and the wolf packs keep transmitting. U-402 was one submarine among hundreds. Von Forstner was one commander among thousands of U-boat crew members. His death changed nothing strategically. The wolf packs continued hunting. BDU continued broadcasting tactical instructions. The submarines continued transmitting position reports, attack results, damage assessments, fuel states, and the Huff-Duff network continued listening. March 1943 became April, April became May, and the killing accelerated. The convoys crossing the Atlantic in the spring of 1943 faced the largest U-boat force ever assembled. Dönitz had 425 submarines operational. Of these, roughly 100 were at sea simultaneously, organized into multiple wolf packs strung across the convoy routes like nets, waiting to trap the merchant ships. But the submarines were dying faster than the shipyards could replace them. May 1st, U-109 sunk southwest of Iceland. May 2nd, U-192 destroyed by depth charges. May 3rd, U-438, U-639. May 4th, U-125, U-531. The casualty reports arrived daily at BDU headquarters. Some days, multiple submarines failed to report. The operations staff would wait the regulation 72 hours before declaring them missing, hoping for a delayed transmission, a surfacing after hiding from escorts. Usually, the transmissions never came. May 5th, U-195, U-352. May 6th, U-438. May 7th, U-663. The numbers became a drumbeat of death. Dönitz ordered his submarines to fight harder, to press home their attacks despite heavy escort defenses. He believed the mounting losses were a temporary crisis, a combination of improved Allied radar, more aggressive escort tactics, and greater air coverage. He believed that if the U-boats could just maintain pressure, keep sinking tonnage, the Allies' resources would crack first. He was wrong. The turning point came during the battles around convoys ONS-5 and SC-129 in early May. ONS-5 was a westbound convoy, slower ships returning empty from Britain to North America to collect more cargo. 43 merchants with an escort of only 7 warships. On April 28th, Grouper Star, a wolf pack of 30 U-boats, made contact. What followed was a 5-day running battle across 1,000 miles of ocean. The U-boats attacked in waves. They sank 13 merchant ships, over 60,000 tons. By conventional measures, it was a German victory, but Grouper Star lost 6 submarines in the battle. And the Allies knew, from Huff-Duff tracking, the position of nearly every U-boat that approached the convoy. When a submarine transmitted to report an attack, escort ships would immediately steam toward that position. When BDU broadcast instructions, vectoring more boats toward the convoy, the Huff-Duff network heard those transmissions too, and the escorts knew which directions to watch. The U-boats were fighting an enemy who could anticipate their movements because the Germans were broadcasting their own tactical plan. 2 weeks later, convoy SC-129 faced Grouper Donau, another large wolf pack, 33 merchant ships, escorted by 9 warships plus an escort carrier HMS Biter with 6 aircraft. The U-boats managed to sink 3 merchants, but they lost 5 submarines, and dozens of other boats in Grouper Donau were forced to dive repeatedly by aircraft vectored to their positions based on Huff-Duff fixes. Every time they dove to evade an aircraft, they lost contact with the convoy. The coordinated wolf-pack attack that Dönitz had planned never materialized because his submarines kept being forced underwater by planes that somehow knew exactly where they were. The mathematics of attrition were becoming undeniable. In the first 22 days of May 1943, the U-boat force sank 58 Allied ships, but Germany lost 31 submarines in 22 days. The construction yards were completing 30 boats per month. At this casualty rate, the entire operational force would be depleted within a year. The crews were becoming demoralized. U-boat commanders who had survived 10 or 12 patrols, who had sunk dozens of ships, were reporting that the Atlantic had become a death trap. Something had changed, they said. The escorts knew too much. They responded too quickly. It felt like the enemy could read minds. They were closer to the truth than they realized. May 24, 1943. Gross Admiral Dönitz sat in his operations room at BDU headquarters on the Avenue Maréchal Maunoury in Paris, studying the casualty reports. 41 U-boats were lost in 30 days. 41. The number was incomprehensible. He had argued with Hitler for years for more submarines, more resources for the U-boat campaign. He had promised that wolf-pack tactics could strangle Britain's supply lines and force a negotiated peace. He had built the largest submarine force in history, and now, in a single month, he had lost nearly 10% of his operational strength. The faces of his staff officers were grim. They had run the calculations. At this loss rate, continuing offensive operations in the North Atlantic wasn't just costly, it was suicidal. Dönitz made the decision that he had been resisting for weeks. He dictated a message to be transmitted to all U-boats operating in the North Atlantic. All boats currently engaged against convoys are to break off operations and proceed to waiting areas southwest of the Azores. Further orders will follow. He was withdrawing the wolf packs from the North Atlantic. In his order, he cited Allied air superiority and improved radar as the primary reasons for the withdrawal. He mentioned the increasing effectiveness of escort groups, the appearance of escort carriers providing air cover for convoys, and the deployment of new anti-submarine weapons. He never mentioned radio direction finding because he didn't know it was killing his submarines. The withdrawal order represented the single most important strategic decision of the Battle of the Atlantic. For the first time since September 1939, the U-boats were conceding defeat in the critical theatre. The North Atlantic convoy routes the lifeline sustaining Britain. The supply line that would enable the eventual invasion of Europe were no longer seriously contested. Dönitz would later describe May 1943 as Black May. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote, "The situation had changed so drastically that continued attacks in the North Atlantic with current resources were no longer justified. We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic." But he never understood why he had lost. The U-boat campaign continued after May 1943, but it never regained its effectiveness. Dönitz shifted operations to other areas, the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean-seeking zones where Allied defences were thinner. He introduced new technologies, the snorkel, which allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged, reducing vulnerability to aircraft, acoustic torpedoes that homed on the sound of ship propellers, faster submarine designs. None of it mattered. The fundamental vulnerability remained. Wolf pack tactics required radio communication, and radio communication meant the Allies knew where you were. By mid-1944, with Allied air power dominating every ocean zone and escort groups trained to a lethal proficiency, U-boat patrols had become extended death sentences. A submarine departing on patrol had roughly a 50% chance of returning. By early 1945, the casualty rate exceeded 75%. Young men, teenagers, many of them, drafted into the Kriegsmarine in the desperate final years of the war-boarded submarines, knowing they would probably die. Some crews refused to sail and were court-martialed and shot. Most went to sea because they had no choice, or because the alternative was service on the Eastern Front, which seemed even worse. Of the approximately 39,000 men who served in German U-boats during the Second World War, 28,000 died. A casualty rate of 72%. 3 out of every 4 men who went to sea in a U-boat never came home. These were individual deaths. Fathers, brothers, sons. Hans Dietrich, the radio operator aboard U-402, was 23. He had studied engineering before the war. His family learned of his death 4 months after U-402 was sunk, when the Reich Navy Office sent a formal notice. Missing, presumed dead, no details available. Wilhelm Schmidt, von Forstner's executive officer, had a daughter born 3 months before his final patrol. He never met her. She grew up knowing her father only through photographs and letters. Multiply these stories, and by 28,000, and you begin to comprehend the human cost. But set against that cost, consider the alternative. If the U-boats had succeeded, if they had cut Britain's Atlantic supply lines, if they had sunk enough tonnage to force Britain out of the war, the outcome of the Second World War would have been catastrophically different. Nazi Germany, unopposed in Europe, consolidating its conquests, implementing its genocidal programs without interference. The Holocaust completed. No D-Day, no liberation of Europe, no defeat of Hitler. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a peripheral campaign. It was the war's central struggle, the prerequisite for everything else. Churchill understood this. Stalin understood this. So did Hitler and Dönitz. And the Allies won that battle, in significant part, because they could hear the enemy's radio transmissions and locate them with precision that the Germans believed impossible. The secret of Huff-Duff was maintained throughout the war, and for decades afterward. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Allied intelligence teams moved quickly to seize German naval records and interrogate surviving U-boat commanders and staff officers. The interrogations were extensive and detailed. The Allies wanted to know what the Germans had suspected, what they had discovered, whether they had any idea why their submarines died in such numbers. The answer was no. The Germans had theories, radar, code-breaking, spies, some new form of sonar, but they had never identified Huff-Duff as the decisive technology. The British continued to classify Huff-Duff's capabilities as secret, even after the war. The technology remained useful in the emerging Cold War, and revealing its full effectiveness would have allowed the Soviets to develop countermeasures. Some details were declassified in the 1950s, more in the 1960s, but the complete picture didn't emerge until the 1970s, when British official histories and declassified documents finally revealed the extent of the Huff-Duff network and its accuracy. By then, surviving U-boat veterans were in their 50s, 60s, 70s. Many had spent decades believing that their comrades had died to superior Allied seamanship, or bad luck, or simple, overwhelming numbers. Learning the truth was bitter. Peter Kremer, who commanded U-333 and survived the war, wrote in his memoir published in 1984, "For years we believed we were fighting against brave enemies who were simply better prepared than we were. Finding out that we had been defeated by our own radio transmissions, that every time we reported a convoy position, we were marking ourselves for death, it felt like a betrayal. Not by the British, who did what any competent enemy would do, but by our own command, which never discovered what was killing us." Reinhard Hardigan, commander of U-123, who conducted operations off the American coast in 1942 and survived the war, said in a 1992 interview, "If we had known about Huff-Duff, everything would have been different. We would have maintained radio silence, operated independently. The Wolfpack concept would have been abandoned. Would we have sunk fewer ships? Yes. Would more of us have survived? Absolutely." Dönitz himself, when confronted with the declassified evidence in the 1970s, initially refused to believe it. He insisted that Allied radar and code breaking had been the decisive factors. When historians showed him the operational records, the Huff-Duff plots that tracked his submarines in real time, the statistical correlation between radio transmissions and U-boat losses, he fell silent. Finally, in an interview conducted in 1973, 2 years before his death, he said, "If we had known the Allies could locate our boats so precisely, so quickly, the entire operational concept would have had to change. But how could we have known? The technology seemed impossible with what we understood in 1943, and even if we had suspected, what could we do? Abandon radio coordination? Then the wolf packs cannot function. Return to individual hunting? Then we sink too little tonnage to achieve strategic effect. We were trapped." He was right. The Germans were trapped by their own tactical success. Wolfpack tactics, when they worked, were devastatingly effective, but making them work required constant radio communication. And radio communication made the submarines visible to an enemy who had developed a technology that seemed, to 1940s understanding, almost like magic. There's a broader lesson here about warfare, intelligence, and the unpredictability of technological advantage. The Germans invested enormous resources in offensive capabilities. They developed the Type 7 U-boat, one of the most successful weapon systems of the war. They refined torpedo technology. They created sophisticated tactical doctrines. They trained skilled crews and aggressive commanders, but they lost because they failed to recognize a defensive vulnerability. They assumed that if radio direction finding existed, it would be crude and imprecise, like their own systems. They couldn't imagine that the British had solved the technical problems necessary to make direction finding accurate to within a couple of miles and fast enough to vector escorts to a submarine within minutes of transmission. This is a pattern that repeats throughout military history. Militaries optimize for the threats they understand and the technologies they possess, and they're often blindsided by capabilities they don't anticipate. In 1914, European armies planned for swift offensive maneuvers, cavalry charges, and decisive battles of movement. They were unprepared for the defensive dominance of machine guns, barbed wire, and field fortifications, leading to 4 years of static trench of warfare. In 1941, the Americans concentrated their Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor because they believed their primary threat was sabotage, not an aerial attack launched from carriers 400 miles away, a capability they thought Japan didn't possess. In the 2000s, Western militaries deployed tanks, aircraft, and sophisticated weapons to Iraq and Afghanistan, then discovered that insurgents could neutralize this technological advantage with improvised explosives costing $50 and buried in roads. The U-boats failed because they were optimized for what submarines do: hunt ships without fully accounting for what submarines are: radio transmitters that happen to be wrapped in steel hulls and filled with torpedoes. Von Forstner, pressing that transmission key at 2:47 a.m. on March 17, 1943, believed he was coordinating a devastating attack on an Allied convoy. He was executing proper tactical doctrine. He was following orders. He was doing everything a competent U-boat commander should do. He was also broadcasting his position to his executioners, and he never knew. Today, somewhere on the abyssal plain of the North Atlantic, 3 miles beneath the surface, the wreck of U-402 rests in eternal darkness. The pressure at that depth is over 6,000 pounds per square inch. No light penetrates. The water temperature is just above freezing. The submarine's hull, crushed by the implosion, lies scattered across the seafloor. Siegfried von Forstner is still there, along with the 46 men of his crew. They have been there for over 80 years. They will remain there, in all likelihood, forever. The depth is too great for salvage operations, and there's no reason to disturb them. The wreck is a war grave, protected by international maritime law. If you could somehow descend to that depth, if you could navigate the darkness and the pressure and the cold, you would find the debris of a Type 7C submarine, sections of hull plating, the conning tower partially collapsed, torpedoes that were never fired, perhaps the radio equipment, corroded but still recognizable. And if you examined that radio equipment, if you could somehow read the logs that disintegrated decades ago, you would find the last message that Oberbootsman Hans Dietrich transmitted, 18 seconds of encrypted Morse code, reporting the submarine's position, the convoy's bearing and speed, the commander's intention to attack. That message travelled outward at the speed of light. A portion of its electromagnetic energy was absorbed by the ocean and the atmosphere, but a portion continued into space, expanding in a sphere centered on U-402's final position. That signal is still traveling, over 80 light-years from Earth now, growing weaker with distance but never quite reaching zero. Somewhere in interstellar space, carried on radio waves that will propagate forever, is Hans Dietrich's final transmission. A young man's voice, encoded in pulses of electromagnetic energy, saying to the universe, "I am here." He was there. For 44 more minutes, and then he wasn't. The Battle of the Atlantic killed over 72,000 people, 36,000 Allied merchant seamen, most of whom drowned when their ships were torpedoed in mid-ocean. 30,000 Allied naval personnel aboard escort ships and patrol aircraft. 28,000 German U-boat crew. Another 5,000 died on surface raiders and supply ships. These numbers are abstractions. They become real only when you consider them as individual deaths. A merchant sailor from Liverpool, 19 years old, who drowned in the North Atlantic because a torpedo blew apart his ship's hull and he couldn't reach a lifeboat in the darkness. A German mechanic's mate, 22 years old, died when his submarine imploded at 300 meters depth. A Canadian corvette commander, 35 years old, who went down with his ship when a U-boat torpedo struck the magazine. Every number in the casualty statistics represents a life ended, a family destroyed, a future erased. And the bitter irony is that so many of those deaths were preventable. If the Germans had discovered Huff-Duff, if they had realized their radio transmissions were killing them, they could have changed tactics. More submarines would have survived. More German sailors would have lived to see the war's end. But also, if the Germans had changed tactics, more Allied merchant ships would have been sunk. More convoys were destroyed. More merchant sailors drowned. The war might have lasted longer. D-Day might have been delayed or rendered impossible. The defeat of Nazi Germany might have taken years longer, at incalculable cost in lives across all theatres. There are no clean moral conclusions here. Only the recognition that war is a machinery that consumes lives on all sides, and that small technological advantages like the ability to locate a radio transmitter in 90 seconds can determine which side's young men die in greater numbers. The final accounting of the Battle of the Atlantic shows that Allied merchant losses peaked in 1942, then declined steadily through 1943 and 1944. By 1945, the Atlantic was effectively an Allied highway. Convoys crossed with minimal losses. The submarine threat, while never eliminated entirely, had been reduced to a manageable nuisance. Historians attribute this victory to multiple factors working in combination: improved convoy tactics, better trained escort groups, long-range patrol aircraft closing the mid-Atlantic gap, escort carriers providing air cover. Code breaking allows convoys to be routed around known U-boat concentrations, more effective depth charges and ahead-throwing weapons like Hedgehog. But underlying all of these factors was Huff-Duff. The ability to locate a transmitting U-boat in 90 seconds gave the Allies an intelligence advantage that multiplied the effectiveness of every other weapon and tactic. It allowed escorts to hunt proactively rather than reactively. It allowed aircraft to be vectored to submarines before they could attack. It turned the vast ocean, which had sheltered the U-boats, into a transparent medium where every radio transmission was a lighthouse beacon marking the submarine's position. And the Germans never knew. That ignorance cost them the campaign and ultimately contributed to their losing the war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.